So my name is Aisha Shahida Simmons. My pronouns are she and her. I am the editor of the Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse Anthology, which recently received the 2020 Lambda Literary Award for Best LGBTQ, in the LGBTQ Anthology. It's a co-winner, I want to be clear. And I scratched out best because there are so many incredible anthologies edited by LGBTQ writers. And so I'm honored that Love with Accountability is one of the two selected. So I want to begin by first declaring that this is a sacred space. This virtual space is sacred. We are centering Black survivors, diasporic Black survivors of child sexual abuse, and recognizing that child sexual abuse is a global pandemic that doesn't have any boundaries in terms of race, gender, sexuality, gender identity, national origin. It happens everywhere. So what we are inviting everyone is to think about in child sexual abuse through the experiences of diasporic Black people living in the United States. And so that's really important. I also want to encourage all of us to remember that we are all, if we are in this hemisphere, from Alaska over to Canada, throughout the North America, South America, Central America, the Caribbean, all the way down to Chile and Argentina, we're in occupied land that was unfortunately stolen and by colonized. Indigenous nations were colonized and just murdered, as well as the labor of enslaved Africans. This whole hemisphere is really founded on rape and theft. And so when we're talking about child sexual abuse, when we're talking about disrupting and ending child sexual abuse contemporarily, we have to remember that it is a part of the makeup of this entire hemisphere. We're speaking about the United States, but I think it's really important not to be US centric and remember that enslavement happened throughout the Americas. Genocide and theft of indigenous land happened throughout this entire hemisphere. So I just want us to remember that and to ground ourselves in that, and claiming this as a sacred space, and that resistance has always been happening ever since 1492, and it continues, and we are very aware of it happening now. In the United States and then globally, just really responses to anti-Black racism. And it is in this context that I think it's really important to talk about the work of disrupting and ending child sexual abuse. It is a pandemic. Children have been they're always sheltering in place. This COVID has exacerbated it, but most children, unless they are runaways, if they are being abused, they have nowhere to turn. So I want us to remember that and not think that it is just because of COVID. It's really critical. And so I want to just read an excerpt from my introduction to the anthology, which I believe sets the context for it. And Black feminist scholar and cultural worker and prolific author, Dr. Bell Hooks wrote, "For me, forgiveness and compassion are always linked. How do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and yet at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? I do not believe incarceration is the answer. Prisons are not focused on rehabilitation, but instead are a kind of modern day enslavement, as the incarcerated are disproportionately Black, Indigenous, and Latinx, and are raped and degraded while in prison. Too often, family and community bystanders ignore child sexual abuse, but the prison system does worse, facilitating its continuation. Equally as important, so many US laws that are in place to protect victim survivors of child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual and domestic violence end up severely punishing and harming survivors more than helping. The National Coalition Survived and Punished has not only documented this frightening reality, its members also organized to decriminalize efforts to survive domestic and sexual violence, support and free criminalized survivors, and abolish gender violence, policing, prisons, and deportations. I believe every victim survivor must take the avenues that best support their full recovery and total healing. Strongly advocating for alternatives to the criminal and justice system helps to deeply interrogate how and why calling the police has been presented as the only solution to the violence that victim survivors face, especially when so many of them are victimized again when the police or any representative of the criminal justice system becomes involved. What are the ways in which we can hold harm doers accountable without getting involved with the very state that brutalizes Black and other communities of color? How do we create accountability mechanisms that address the needs of the immediate survivors without discarding the harm doers, including bystanders? What are the alternatives to prison that hold people who commit harm accountable by giving them consequences for the horrible atrocities that they commit? What do community accountability, transformative justice, and restorative justice look like in response to child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence? My goals for this anthology are to provide multiple roadmaps that explore how we can disrupt, end, and prevent child sexual abuse. These writings have emerged from the lived experiences of a collective of diasporic Black child sexual abuse survivors, advocates, and one former bystander, my mother. And so I will stop there and create space to bring the first contributor who's going to read. I want to just, because I didn't share I share my story as a survivor in the introduction. I just didn't want to read that. I wanted to create the context, but I am a survivor of child sexual abuse and adult rape, and I think it's really important to name that because so many of us cannot, specifically around child sexual abuse, because it's connected to our loved ones. And my harm doer was my grandfather, who is an ancestor, and my parents were bystanders because I told them what happened and they didn't remove me from the situation. And so that is where Love with Accountability emerges, because I started writing them love with accountability. Emails basically saying that I love them, but my love for them would not shield them from being held accountable for the harm that they cause. So just wanted to give that context. So the first reader is Key Alexander, and their pronouns are they and them. And Key is a queer, trans, Black Puerto Rican scholar, educator, organizer, and consultant based in Minneapolis. They are currently a doctoral student in education, curriculum, and instruction with a focus on culture and teaching at the University of Minnesota. Their work and scholarship centers queer, Black feminist thought, transformative justice, abolition, and healing justice. And Key and I go back to Philly days for over a decade ago, and they are a really dear friend, comrade, teacher, and community member, and really have learned a lot from Key around transformative justice, and I'm very excited to have them share from their chapter, and then Key and I was about to say they and I, but language, Key and I will then talk about the work. So I'm gonna turn off my video and let the focus stay on Key.
Thank you so much, Aisha. I just want to start by saying thank you, deep gratitude to your work and bringing all these amazing contributors together, as well as just being a mentor in my life. I'm deeply grateful. So I'm going to read a part from my chapter, which is called Thoughts on Discipline, Justice, Love, and Accountability. I'm starting on page 267 if anybody wants to look it up later. We have an aversion to punishment. We learn these patterns of punishment as children. They show up in our homes, schools, and larger communities. The conflation of discipline, punishment, power and abuse, structure and fear becomes normalized. So much order in our society is maintained not by people's desire to genuinely do the right thing, but rather by people's desires to not get caught for doing the wrong thing. So what happens when young people experience harm from the people who are supposed to protect them? These conflated ideas and patterns teach young people that any harm they experience is brought on by themselves. They too must maintain order in their families, and if they challenge any behavior that has become normalized, they become a disruption to the family. Negative reinforcement doesn't help people change their behavior, whether they have caused or received harm. People do not learn through shame. But our injustice system is set up in such a way that isolates both the people who have caused harm and the survivors. It is set up to scare people into changing through the negative consequences of their action rather than to confront the issues that set the conditions for abuse. Sitting with the word discipline, I realized that I similarly struggled with the word justice. What does justice look like in the context of child sexual abuse? Our society tells us that when justice is served, holding someone responsible means punishing them. They are thus thrown into a system that promotes more fear, shame, and isolation. There are a multitude of reasons why survivors of CSA don't speak about their abuse, often because they experience those same conditions of fear, shame, and isolation. These are conditions that don't actually help people heal, change, or grow. Is it really justice if someone suffers from abuse as I did? Is justice served if someone is robbed of the community and the care it takes to become a better person? Is it justice if someone gets locked up in a box and not given the opportunity to heal, just to harm others again? What might it look like if we approach justice from a place of love rather than fear? We are taught that leading from a place of love will only get us taken advantage of and lead us to more pain and hurt. No one wants to talk about love, especially within the context of child sexual abuse and other forms of sexual violence. Violation of any form of intimacy is devastating, particularly in the familial context for children and young adults. It can affect our lives into adulthood. This can become difficult for folks to unpack, as love is often used as a way to manipulate young people. We don't want to talk about love when it is taken from us or used against us, so why would we offer love to someone who has done that to us? And that's the end of my piece.
Thank you, Key. I really wanted to thank you for that excerpt, and I think it's so appropriate just in this time when we're talking about when there's so much discussion, state sanctioned discussion around discipline and consequences. And I think part of the reason that child sexual abuse is really hard for us to talk about, it's hard for us to talk about for a whole host of reasons, and really thinking about in Black communities, because our communities are held under siege by the state, by the police. So how do we respond when these atrocities are occurring? How do we respond to these inhumane atrocities without becoming inhumane to the person who's causing harm? So I feel like your chapter really, thoughts on discipline, justice, love, and accountability, really poses those questions. And it poses questions and answers, but really would love for you also to share about some of the work. I don't know what you're doing in Minneapolis, but I know the work that you did in Philly, and perhaps you're doing some of that as well. Because one of the things I think about is, like, I think it's important to be survivor-centered, and also who's going to do the work with the harm doers.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was part of a collective in Philadelphia called Philly Stands Up, which is a small local grassroots collective of queer people that were trying to do exactly what you lifted up, right? Trying to respond to instances of sexual violence without relying on the state. Understanding that as Black folks, as queer folks, and trans folks, that the state often perpetuates more harm in our communities rather than bringing safety or healing. And so it was a way for us to work with folks who had caused harm by holding accountability processes and working with them to help transfer their behavior and integrate them back into community. And so my work with Philly Stands Up was, we all different members worked on accountability processes, but then also political education around these kind of issues. So really talking with people, asking these hard questions, digging through what are we going to do about the bad people, right? And I think that work taught me a lot about, the justice system that we have is not actually responding to those bad people to begin with. The majority of people who are causing harm are not incarcerated for, for those actions. So I think there's this risk about like, what do we do with the most harmful people? But like the current justice system is also not attending to that in the moment. And so a lot of that work for me has been about based in prison abolition and talking about the ways that the prison system is directly connected to settler colonialism and anti-Blackness and a continuation of chattel slavery. So having that understanding is one thing analytically, but then really like talking to everyday people, your neighbors, about why we don't call the cops or why we don't want to advocate for people being incarcerated has been challenging work. Is work that I've been doing a lot around. And so for me, it's been a very humbling experience to understand that harm is not a binary, and that most people who cause harm are survivors of violence and harm themselves. And so when we are not actually supporting people to change their behavior and grow, that cycle will always continue. And so it's I see the work as disrupting that cycle of isolation and supporting people to do better, understanding that some people will choose not to do better. And that's also okay. And then we make different boundaries according to that. But I inherently think that people are good and need opportunities to change and grow and can't do that in isolation. And incarceration is only about dehumanization and isolation. So I'm continuing to do that work here in Minneapolis. I work as a transformative justice coach for a Black, queer, and trans-led organization here that's leading the charge to defund the police in Minneapolis. And so really I find my work now about how do we embody these ideas of transformative justice in our everyday lives? How do we treat the people that we're in relationship to? What happens when we deal with conflict? If we learn how to do them in these more nuanced interpersonal ways, it allows us to build the muscle and the muscle memory to be able to do that on a larger scale.
Great. And how, just very briefly, in terms of, because you are in Minneapolis, how are things there? How what's happening in terms of MSNBC or CNN is saying? What is Key saying?
Lots of things are happening. There's some really amazing work. I've been really, really inspired by Minneapolis, the residents of really leaning into what a world without police can look like. So I think the thing that's not being shown on TV is the ways that Minneapolis residents are practicing in real time what their communities without police might be like. So after the initial uprisings that were happening, there was a lot of, the National Guard came, choppers, sirens all the time, and then also white supremacists running through our neighborhoods. And communities really came together. My community ended up doing a neighborhood watch. That's not kind of like your standard neighborhood watch, but really like people going to community meetings, talking about abolition, which, I wasn't expecting, older white folks in my neighborhood in Minneapolis to say abolition if they want to defund the police, and kind of working with folks to keep watch of each other's homes, create ways for people to get connected, be safe, neighbors watching out for each other, and then just a huge amount of mutual aid, right? Like people feeding each other, people getting supplies. There was we had the People's Laundry, People's Ambulance, like all these different initiatives started by people on the ground to really just help their neighbors and help their communities survive this massive tragedy. And I've really never seen anything like it. I mean, I know a lot about mutual aid, specifically from queer and trans folks of color, particularly sick and disabled folks, and have seen the ways that mutual aid has showed up on a small scale. But I've been really humbled to see like citywide across like how people are really taking care of each other and taking care of their neighbors. I actually used to live around the corner from where George Floyd was murdered, and that whole area has become a memorial sacred site in the city, led by Black folks. And, you know, there's been food every day and like free food and cooking and art and murals and talking to children about these issues in a way that I've never seen before. So I'm really, really inspired and humbled to see what the city of Minneapolis is doing.
Thank you, Q. And I'm gonna ask you to please turn off your camera and bring up Dr. Tama Bryant Davis. And we're gonna switch interpreters from Yolanta Galloway to Nicole Schindler. And I'm gonna introduce you, Tama. So, I don't need to do that. All right. So I'm going to read the bio and then say a little something. So Dr. Tama Bryant Davis is a licensed psychologist and professor of psychology at Pepperdine University. Dr. Tama directs the Culture and Trauma Research Lab and hosts the Homecoming podcast on SoundCloud and YouTube. Her work in mental health was recently featured in Essence magazine. I was almost going to say that I've known Tama the longest, but that's not true. Almost the longest. I've known Tama since the 90s, Dr. Tama since the 90s, in our shared work to disrupt and end sexual violence. Tama is also a poet and a theologian and just all around incredible woman. So everybody's incredible, I want to be clear, but just in terms of if you've ever seen Tama perform, she pulls you in. So I will let you read and share and I'll come back afterwards. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for creating this space for us, and thank you each of you for joining. Along with being a psychologist, clinician, and researcher, I'm also a survivor, and as Aisha shared, it's important to say that. Many times people only see survivors when they're in their place of devastation. And so for those of us who have survived and continue to heal and thrive, it is important to name that process to know that that is possible. And so the piece that I'm going to share from my chapter is actually a poem. And I want to say before I start reading it, that when we're talking about sexual abuse, in various forms, that it can bring up a lot. And just by you being present, many of you are survivors or allies. And so I encourage you to take good care of yourself in your listening, tuning into your body and breath, and grounding yourself in this present moment that we are here together. And I hope that you are in a safer place. All right. Molestation gets buried in the rib cages of children, in the pelvic bones of children, the hearts, lungs, and memories of children. These children, we children, grow up. And from the vantage point of strangers, we may look like sturdy oak trees, but those who dare to look closely see the sores on our bark, experience the tangled roots of our emotions, witness the disconnected gaps in our branches, but most don't look, retreating habitually to the averted gaze of eyes shut, refusing to bear witness, willing our children to stand under the weight, celebrating those who manage to soar despite the weight on our wings. We directly and indirectly give our children the script of silence. No one, after all, wants to hear about ghosts that came in the night, often sharing our same last name. No one wants to think about the intrusions on toddlers, the fingers, or the hellish hot breath whispers, the violation of bodies still young enough to carry lunchboxes and backpacks. No one wants to sit with the truth of the dismantling of adolescence, those left sobbing in the fetal position, limping back to homeroom. Shallow breath as intruders descend upon us. It's easier to talk about God or report cards or television shows or what's for dinner and even problems facing the Black community. Anything really is more palatable than shh. Our silence does not save us and definitely does not heal us. But even with the demand for silence, the violation speaks, often in riddles. The violation discovers the code of nonverbal communication. The abuse screams in the muffled voices of depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, anger, panic attacks, addiction, dissociation, suicidality, ADHD, oppositional defiant disorder. Translated in our communities with other labels like bad attitude, too sensitive, drama queen, troubled, zapping out, spacing out, irritating, troublemaker, bad hygiene, forgetful, too grown for her good, shy, secretive, quiet, weird, emotional, cold, moody, off. Forgetting they told us with words and deeds to hush, but we need space to think, feel, speak, connect, process, restore. We need seeing eyes, listening ears, open hearts. The silence strangles us again, again, and again. Yet often those who encourage silence would in most cases say they love us. It's the kind of love that walks on eggshells around sexual violence. The kind of love that would defend us against the sting of racism or the mistreatment by a teacher, a stranger, or in some cases, a bully. But when a vagina, penis, anus, breasts are involved, our loved ones run out of words, cloaking themselves in silence or uncomfortable laughter. After all, most grew up in houses where those words were neither uttered nor alluded to, especially in relationship to children. They were not given the vocabulary for this test, so they leave their paper blank. Putting roof overhead, food on the table, God in your heart, goals in your mind, and this, my sisters and brothers, is love. But the silenced love does not save us when the vultures come to eat up our flesh, desecrating our temples, leaving 4-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds to gather the sharp edges of shattered pieces of themselves alone. Loved ones can think silence is a gift, hoping children will forget, not dwell on it, not focus on it. If we don't speak it, we can falsely believe that we have erased it, but it remains, busting out of the seams of our souls. Thank you.
Whew. Thank you.
Thank you.
Power of poetry. So I would just ask you to just talk a little more about your chapter, because the chapter is a mixture of poetry and prose, a real call to action, and invite you to talk about that.
So I really appreciate your phrasing of love with accountability, because often those who are silent, the bystanders, um, often in their way, with their own brokenness, love us. And also, what I speak to in the chapter is they often have love for the offender. It is so much easier for us to think about people in dichotomies, that there are angels and devils, there are monsters and saints, and it becomes very, very complicated when the abuser, offender, perpetrator has various aspects to themselves. And so some people gravitate to the parts of that person they know and allow that to erase either the possibility that the abuse happened, or even acknowledging that it did happen, not wanting to discard the person or to disrupt or to rock the boat. And so who gets sacrificed is often the children. And so they are told not to speak about it. And there is an additional layer when we talk about racism, of a distrust of people outside of the family, and yet the family is not doing anything about it. So we cannot even say, well, we don't trust these institutions, we'll handle it. No, what often gets said is, we don't trust these institutions, and so let's not talk about it. And let's not do anything, and nothing will change, and people remain vulnerable. And so the pressure is often put on the survivor to protect the family and to protect the race with their silence. And one of the responses that I often give to Black survivors I'm working with is that when you break silence, you are not the one that is betraying the family or betraying the community, but those who preyed on you, who violated you, those are the ones who have betrayed the family, betrayed the community. And so we really have to speak about the need for accountability. And this is especially important. I will say that on average, people in our community have a higher endorsement of religiosity or spirituality. And often from a religious or spiritual sense, people will put a lot of pressure on survivors to forgive. And often that forgiveness is without any accountability, without any transformation, without any repentance. And so the weight of the abuse and the recovery is put on the shoulders of children, and that is not healing, and it's not acceptable, and there are costs. And many times we think if we don't speak about it, then it didn't really have an impact. But even when we look intergenerationally at our parents, at our grandparents, at our aunts and uncles, that many times the violations that were not spoken about showed up in their behavior, in their thinking, in their relationships, in their addictions.
Thank you. Thank you. I want to kind of just veer off for 1 second, particularly because of your being a psychologist, and just ask you if you, I saw a question that said, that asked, how do we stop incest, child sexual abuse? The system is failing to keep the 5-year-old safe. I'm the grandmother. I've been alienated. The child told me, and I can't help him. The abuser is his father, my son.
So people are put in the hard position, the uncomfortable position of jeopardizing their relationship with the person, with the offender. Because sometimes to confront, to address the abuser is to risk, are they going to get mad at me? And we have to ask ourselves the question, Am I willing to face the discomfort and even the rejection of my own child because I believe my grandchild's life is worth saving? That I believe their bodily integrity matters. I believe their mental health matters. And I'm hoping that I don't lose my son, but I know that my silence to protect our relationship, that the cost is too high. And so there is a need for addressing and confronting and also counseling for the child, and separately counseling for the person who is engaging in the abusive behavior. And so to speak from the heart about our concern for both of them, that all is not well. All is not well in the life of the victim or survivor, and also all is not well in the life experience and the reality of your son. And so it is uncomfortable, but I would say it is necessary. And I would also think about the long-term picture, that people may be angry with you now, upset with you now, but in the life of your grandchild, when they are left to heal, let me say this, survivors, one of the big predictors of how survivors heal in the long run is the response to their disclosure. So if you have two people who are molested and they both tell, and one person is defended, supported, brought to safety, witnesses someone speaking up for them, their outcome and their recovery process is so much better than the survivor who was not believed, or who was told just don't talk about it, or just saw nothing happen. And on average, when a child discloses, the abuse continues for another year. So we want to feel the urgency of now.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to bring up the next contributor and have you come back.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, so Nicole K. Queen Denson is our next contributor. And she is real, revolutionary, energetic, all-encompassing leader. Nicole is a mother, a daughter, a sister, a Detroit native, social justice activist, CEO, and founder of Mosaic Collective Consulting. I met Nicole just a couple of years ago at the Black Women's Blueprints March for Black Women. And ever since that time, we connected, and I invited her to contribute to the anthology, and wrote the piece, and just have really learned about so much of the incredible work that she's been doing, that she does and has done in Detroit. So she will read from her chapter and then talk about your work. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Aisha, for having me, for having us, and for your leadership. One of the ways I found out about you was the No documentary, and it changed my life forever. And every time I did training in my nonprofit, I was happy to uplift you. So thank you so much for everything. So my chapter is chapter 33. It's called Poetic Justice. It is dedicated to Kaylee, Kiana, and Raquel, loves of my life. I am honored to experiencing loving you. Continue to set this world on fire. Not fire, fire. And so I'm starting on page 235, and I'm starting at Kaylee and the new era of Detroit. The painful memories of my father recently came back with a vengeance. My daughter Kaylee turned 4 this year. She is the love of my life. Her big brown eyes and amazing smile are two of the many reasons that I vowed to help protect her and all people in the city of Detroit and survivors of sexual assault everywhere. Each day, with every breath I take, Kaylee's birth reminded me that my body is beautiful, from every stretch mark to every blemish. Instead of trauma occurring throughout my body, I was loving as well as present within my body when I experienced giving birth to a baby. One day this past January, something happened as I was bathing my daughter in my mother's tub. And she was playing as I sang to her. I suddenly began to dissociate and have flashbacks. I immediately asked my mother, Kaylee's grandmother, to watch her. I ran out of the room and began praying. All of a sudden, I was the 4-year-old girl again, in the same tub, looked up while my father opened his pants and masturbated in front of me. I collected my thoughts, used grounding techniques that I learned through my work, became present again. Unlike in previous flashback experiences, I now had a plan in place to support myself when flashbacks occurred. Kaylee is a beacon of light in the darkness of this world. She is bright, she is hilarious, and a wonderful dancer. I admire her bravery and her creativity. Miss Kaylee will unapologetically wear both a cape and a tutu at the same time. As a result of my trauma history, I'm sure I parent differently than some, if not many. Kaylee knows the correct terminology for all of her body parts. She is empowered with body autonomy. I pray every night to completely interrupt my family's generational cycle of trauma. I want to be the last person in our line who has experienced child sexual abuse, trafficking, and intimate partner violence. As a survivor of child sexual abuse, I've been dealing with sexual violence almost my entire life. And I have worked professionally to end sexual violence for the past 15 years. I'm the former director of advocacy services at the Wayne County SAFE, Wayne County Sexual Assault Forensic Examinations Program. Wayne County SAFE provides those affected by sexual assault with immediate and ongoing comprehensive services at no cost that encourage survivor healing and empowerment to promote public awareness and lead social change. Wayne County SAFE is a nonprofit, is a 501c3, and is a comprehensive organization that provides compassionate and trauma-informed care to survivors of sexual assault throughout Wayne County. Wayne County SAFE provides a safe, quiet, confidential environment with specifically trained forensic examiners who provide medical examinations and forensic evidence collection for rape. I love our community, volunteers, and important, the courageous survivors who break their silence. When I saw survivors walk out of those exam rooms and counseling offices, I often saw warriors with armor and wings ready for battle. It's not easy to begin in being a survivor, especially for those who must navigate racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia that affect their daily lives. Wayne County Safe assists almost 1,000 survivors of sexual violence at its offices and clinic sites. Unfortunately, in 2009, we learned that many of the stories of the survivors who are seen every day were completely buried. I am referring to the over 11,000 untested rape kits that were found in an abandoned warehouse. It was a consolable tragedy and has been painful for us in Detroit. Over 81% of the untested rape kits involve African American women survivors. Before this atrocity was exposed, many of us hadn't believed the criminal justice system took our stories and cases seriously. Now, we had tangible proof of what our lived experiences had in us. As an advocate, even apart from injustices like this, one about the rape kits, it is hard as an advocate to cultivate hope for justice for rape survivors that are currently going through exams and counseling. It took over 8 years for the DNA evidence in these kits to be tested. An interdisciplinary team of us pushed Michigan state legislature to implement mandatory requirements, ensuring that every kit was tested. Since learning of the tragedy, Wayne County Safe has been involved with assisting the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office in working with the survivors connected to the previously untested 11,341 rape kits. My fear, however, is that because of the lack of resources and the high level of victimization, we will unfortunately witness similar problems in our future. In Detroit, we lack adequate medical care, schools, housing, and even shelters for people who are homeless. So when we ask a woman who was sexually assaulted as a child 15 or 20 years ago if she would like to testify, most people involved in the process do not consider whether she had a safe place for her or her children to stay. This is unacceptable to me. My main motivation for shouting from the megaphone, chanting, and marching is for my sisters survivors and for all of us and our children. Thank you.
Thank you. Whew. Got a little emotional. Thank you, sister. Thank you. I want to just ask you, I know, your chapter, I mean, every single chapter moved me. It was, you take us through a whole journey from, victimization to survivor to warrior to healer. And so I just want to acknowledge that, and just you're talking about the work. And I know you're not there are several of us, not us, I'm not one, but who are our parents. Dr. Tama's one, Dr. Danielle, and you. And so just wanting to thank you, and wanted to ask you, one of the things that I was struck by in your chapter, and you didn't talk about this, was in terms of just trafficking. So often the images of trafficking, we don't see our images of Black people. And, you know, you talk about your experiences. And then, and just also in the work in a predominantly Black city such as Detroit, in terms of talking about these issues. You touch on that.
Well, first of all, thank you for your kind words, because you know I hold you with the highest regard. And the trafficking piece is key, because you know, when we talk about child sexual abuse, sometimes we leave that out. We like to concentrate on incest and or you know, different issues within the school, and having teachers or people who are violating students, and the barriers behind having to speak up in families, school structures, in our communities that are very tight-knit. So I'm happy you brought up the trafficking piece, because when I have spoken out or when I have done more research, it seems to be very limited with people of color, in particular Black women, Indigenous women, in those spaces in trafficking movements work. And so I felt that I had to learn the education piece to even understand what trafficking was or is. If you look at the historical context, my mother and my family can tell you about a younger quote unquote person who was married off in the South to individuals or men who had land or men who had some type of quote unquote wealth, and that is what they called marriage at that time. So here I am as a 30-something with parents that are in their 70s. And so here I am also, when you look at that dynamic, I'm also in a city that practices silence of what happens in this house stays in this house, or we don't want to air our dirty laundry, or we don't, you know, trust our criminal justice system, rightfully so. Yet it's this compartmentalized feeling you have of not knowing who to turn to or what even you're experiencing. So I met my trafficker at Northland Mall when I was on my 16th birthday. He didn't come across, he didn't put me in a van, he didn't do anything of those horrible magnitude of violations at that time. What he did was he groomed me. And I speak about this in the book. I had lost my father less than a year, my abuser, in a tragic accident. And so then after that, unfortunately, my trafficker came in. And so I'm happy you mentioned that, because a lot of times people would see me. I did good at school, but I throughout my life, did that because that was my escape. But a lot of people didn't understand the travesties that I was facing in my home, because my trafficking didn't look the same. I came home every day. There's no way my mother would have let me go anywhere else. And so it's done in such a strategic way that it has to be conversations like this for us to challenge. And we can't just depend on the FBI. Can't depend on nonprofits. We can't depend on the criminal justice system to know what it's like to go through that situation. And I know this from sitting at those tables. And guess what? As a young advocate, I thought I was doing the best thing by always dealing with the systems, not in dealing with sexual assault survivors, but their perpetrators. And I learned through dealing with the criminal justice system for survivors who failed us all the time, that if they don't fail us all the time, do you think that they would do something different for the perpetrators? And so now here I am, where I deal with systems work, but I also deal with restorative justice now. And here is this marriage of me learning all of these mosaics that is not no one way of healing. It's multiple facets. And I had to learn through, unfortunately, that sexual abuse, that human trafficking, drug-facilitated sexual assault, to get to be the advocate, the client, the volunteer, the director, mother, daughter, and a community member, an activist, to be here. But I wasn't here alone. It's because of people like you Aisha, people like Janice, people like all of the other contributors and authors that made me here to be able to say this. And I just thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to move on so we can all come back and bring up, thank you, Nicole. Oof. Dr. Danielle Moss. Can you please turn on your camera? Oh, and we got to switch interpreters just a minute. Sorry. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Nicole. Hello, Yolanta. Ending video. All right. So, Dr. Danielle Moss. Nicole, can you turn off your camera, please? Okay, great. Dr. Danielle Moss is a social justice activist and currently serves as the CEO of Oliver Scholars, an educational nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting and uplifting the next generation of Black and Latinx leaders. Nicole also has a new podcast. Danielle has a new podcast, Danielle for the People. Danielle is definitely the person I've known the longest on this. We go back to my freshman year at Swarthmore College. So before, we go back a long time. And I think about that in the context of this anthology because we were both survivors, but I definitely wasn't talking about this at 18 years old. No, and you weren't talking about it as, when you were a sophomore, but she was one of my big sisters at Swarthmore, and really happy to be peers and sister comrades. And we'll let you begin your reading and come back.
So I think the section that I'm going to read from really speaks to the social construct that is childhood. My chapter is chapter 13, Love-Centered Accountability. Childhood sexual abuse. The words sit still, dank, and sickening in my throat. Childhood sexual abuse. It is the violation that breaks, upends, and cripples those of us who are survivors. Barely old enough to name our hands and feet and arms and toes. Barely old enough to spell our names and write our names in print. However, for some, we were just old enough. When I see it abbreviated to CSA, my quivering stomach quiets a bit. The acronym gives me the distance I need to speak life into a new world order where children are safe and free and thriving. Like many survivors, I learned early on not to talk about this pain out loud to anyone, not to name the offender because it was a pang of guilt, a sick kind of unholy covenant that we now shared together. I learned early on what it means to be silent, tight-lipped, isolated, and broken. CSA is the dirty secret we gift our children through our silence, our rage, our shame over generations. Whether the abusers are family members, family friends, or authority figures with access to our children, we teach our young ones that sex and feelings and bodies don't make for polite conversation. We give their genitalia nicknames. And though we have created a sexualized world, a world that has few spaces where children can live free from gender roles, our fraught notions of sexuality, our mixed cultural signals about sex, we struggle to speak its existence and create healthy pathways to sexual identity. The reality is that despite our contrived sexual conservatism, sometimes and for the worst reasons, childhood and sex come together. Moreover, the resulting wounds live on as permanent scars because we teach our children that things that cut into them the most must not be named, spoken of, or confronted. In fact, most of the cultural lexicon on American childhood pivots around the notion that children are powerless, and the social arrangement relies on children's ability to submit to and recognize authority. In many communities of color, the mantra that children should be seen and not heard is not just a funny quip we overheard our grandmothers say. We live by a code that promotes the invisibility of our kids and that devalues their voices and experiences, even when their lives depend on their views being heard. So what does this mean with regard to love-centered accountability? Most of us don't understand what love-centered accountability means, because when it comes to accountability, the themes of punishment and pain and discipline are central to our culture. How many of us, when we were growing up, heard our parents say they beat us because they loved us? We condition our children to a love-pain connection early on that leads to the acceptance of all kinds of emotional and physical violence because they don't know the difference. Our propensity for using embarrassment and humiliation to solicit compliance and cooperation from our children is another reason we are challenged by love-centered accountability. At home, in school, and even through social media, part of the way we solicit children's cooperation and obedience is the fear of public shame. The social contract we've created with our children makes it incredibly difficult to initiate conversations and communication that could actually keep our children safe. And ironically, the shame that even parents and other protectors experience about childhood sexual abuse undermines people's ability to protect children adequately. Our concept of healthy sexuality and how to hold people accountable in a way that doesn't leave us owning their sins makes some children's brave disclosures fall on deaf ears. Many survivors talk about the added isolation and rejection they experienced as their brave disclosures went unrecognized. Did my mother, grandmother, father really not believe me? Or did they see my violation as a commentary on their ability to adequately protect me? The denial and rejection of brave disclosure are rooted in the same concepts of shame and fear that make it so difficult for victims to come forward in the first place. Beyond our failure as a society to adequately address CSA as a problem that cuts across race and class, the reality is that even what goes unnoticed, unacknowledged, and unrecognized grows roots that sprout and expand and incapacitate our children as they climb toward adulthood. Thank you.
Thank you, Danielle. Oof. You touched on so much around how shame and blame and humiliation are used, and then how that then plays a role in the in child sexual abuse, being able to spread. Thank you. Spread. And so I wanted to just talk with you about, particularly because of your work with young, you're an educator and have been working with young people in all facets. So now you're with the Oliver Scholars, but also in terms of the YWCA, and that's, and what are your visions in terms of how we can really tackle this this pandemic, and without relying on systems that just continuously brutalize our communities?
I mean, I think the social contract we've created around what it means to be a child versus what it means to be an adult is partly to blame, I guess, if we're going to go there, in terms of like laying the groundwork for situations where our kids aren't safe. Because so much of how we raise our kids, educate our kids, engage with young people, does not posit them as the experts in their own experience and lives. And I think as a youth worker, not as a teacher, but as a youth worker, I think my relationships with the young people I serve have been predicated on our equality in the human family. And the fact that I see young people, I mean, they are seen, they are heard, their values, their words, their experiences in spaces that I occupy have power and have meaning and have the potential and the possibility to reshape and reimagine whatever organization I'm a part of. And for people who want to know, like, how would you have this conversation with young people? You know, you wouldn't go from 0 to 10,000, right? You have to lay a foundation of trust, of mutual respect, of visibility. Young people have to see that they have power in your space in order to disclose. I have had young people disclose to me over the years, and I think those have been students that I had done the work and done the labor of not just saying that I'm a safe adult, but demonstrating that I was a safe adult, and demonstrating through my words, through my actions, and showing up in ways that did not diminish or discount their experiences. And a lot of young people, because sometimes parenthood is built on this idea of ownership, almost in a way. And I think, you know, I think the most tragic conversation I had around this was a young woman who had been violated and wanted to know, do I ever get to say no to anyone who wants my body? Because I'm holding this shame, right? So it's almost like, do I now belong to every person who wants sex from me? Like, am I, you know, because I'm damaged, right? Because I have this shame, because I have this secret, do I ever get to say to a partner, maybe I had sex with you yesterday, today I don't want to have sex with you, right? And so, you know, do I get to push back against a trusted adult who wants to touch me, but who knows that someone else has touched me? You know, so I think really kind of reimagining the social contract around how we engage with children and young people is really a core foundational notion of building. What are the building blocks? Because a lot of young people don't disclose. Like, I was an adult before I ever had the courage to even talk about this issue. And my own mother found out because she read a diary, right? This was not something that I ever had plans to talk about. And Aisha, you know that when you approached me with this project, I was very conflicted, right? Because some of these relationships still exist, right? And so part of coming into an adult, becoming an adult, has been, we're just going to pretend like this never went down, right? So what does it mean for me to come forward as a thriver, I want to say, and create space to process this whole experience?
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to keep it moving, so because we have 2 more contributors and I really want to, we have questions. So thank you. Oh, Danielle, you're like gone. Thank you. So Shavar, will you please turn on your camera and unmute your phone, unmute your video. Hello, my sister. So Shavara is daughter descendant of both immigrant and enslaved, a Black woman with Jewish roots. She is an award-winning diversity and inclusion strategist, social entrepreneur, social justice activist, independent filmmaker, and international speaker whose journey of survivorship informs her work and inspires her passion to build a more equitable world. Shavar and I share the identity of being movement babies, and have known Shavar. I met her in the mid 2000s, and her father is the famous civil rights leader, Reverend James Luther Bevel. And it's just, I mean, who knew that we were going to lose two great giants, Reverend C.T. Vivian and John Lewis, over just past weekend as we're leading into this. And so I shared with Shavar in advance, and she's going to share from her story, but that I really wanted to talk about, just the complexities, and then the complexities when the person who's caused harm has also done such incredible seismic transformative work, changing the face of this country. So I will let Shavar read, and we will then talk afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much for creating this powerful space. And I also want to thank the other contributors. Much of what you shared resonates deeply with me. So thank you for your truth and your authenticity. I'm going to be reading from chapter 3, Soul Survivor, Reimagining Legacy. Suffocating silence became my survival. I soon discovered that there was no safety in the dark recesses of my mind where I wandered to escape, wrestling with a burden that became too heavy to bear, not yet discovering my strength. The secret had nowhere to hide, and I began to define myself and the world around me through the complex language of childhood sexual abuse. I am a survivor of incest. I am a survivor of incest at the hands of my father, hands that crafted the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade, hands raised in fiery indignation at Brown Chapel in Selma, Alabama, on the night my father urged a crowd of 600 to march and demand that segregationist Governor George Wallace stop disenfranchising Negro people. Hands that lay still across his chest after he succumbed to stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Truth is complex. My father secured my liberation, and he betrayed that freedom. Perhaps we both paid too high a price. After my father's funeral, a journalist asked if I loved my father. Speechless because I had never pondered this question, I responded a few days later. My father is perhaps not the monster I once believed him to be, but more simply a man with human frailty, sexually abused as a child himself, ensnared in a past from which he never healed, incapable of facing himself in the end. My life is forever shaped in immeasurable ways by the fiery principled parts of him, remnants of love, resilience, and brilliance that helped him shape a movement. My life was altered by his violation and strengthened by my resolve to reimagine love and legacy and use the horror of my abuse in ways that are healing and empowering.
Thank you, Shavara. Thank you. So, one of the things that I would like to just talk about briefly, and then in the context, is also in terms of the letters that you found from your father, because one of the things that we think about, I mean, it's so easy to focus on this person caused harm, and definitely caused harm. But we, as Key talked about in the beginning, so many of those who cause harm have been harmed, which doesn't condone the harm, but it helps us to see this continuum, and how you reconciled, and particularly like when the film Selma came out by Ava DuVernay, like how do you reconcile all of that important, on the one hand, celebration of the incredible work that your father did, and then also the horrible acts that he did with you and your siblings, some of your siblings.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that question. You know, as a diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioner, I'm often asking the clients and the people with whom I'm engaging, I ask them to imagine embracing the possibility of both and. The duality and the complexity of who we are as human beings. And you're right, you know, during our trial, we had a year-long incest trial that was covered by the Washington Post magazine. And at the end of the trial, after our father had died, we discovered, one of my sisters actually discovered a letter where my father, he admits to being a pedophile. It's a letter to God. And he begins the letter by saying, I would prefer being dead rather than being a curse to others. And so I say farewell. And he talks about living because he was cowardly and begged, and he begged for his physical life. But then he says, even in that situation, he was more concerned about his physical life than he was of God, his kingdom, and righteousness. And although he had the power to heal and bring people into the kingdom, he chose instead to use the power to elicit sex from ignorant, immature girls. His words. And then at the end of that, he says, and since that day, I have not experienced his love, God's love, nor the joy of my salvation, and I have not confessed this sin and error because of shame and pride. And thus I am a liar and an enemy of God. Mm. And when I first read that letter, it was right before my sister Errol and I were going into court for a hearing. And I had long since forgiven my father, which was more about me being able to heal and less about him. And the letter was closure to some degree, because up until his dying breath, he did not admit. He decided to hold on to his truth that none of this had happened, not his violation of me, nor the violation of 4 of my other sisters. So the letter was a powerful part of closure, and it also simply made me cry. I can't imagine. I'm not connected to God in that way. I am spiritual, not committed to a particular faith. And so I can't imagine. My father was an ordained minister, and knowing how much he loved humanity by the work that he did, how much he loved God, and recognizing that there was something wrong that he was not able to reconcile. So that was a powerful moment of truth for me. And part of what was challenging during the trial was some of the backlash that we were receiving from the movement folks, who were very concerned about us sharing our truth and how that might mar the movement, how legacy might be shifted. So there was this additional burden from our own Black community.
Shabara, can you briefly just share I said your father, but I think for people who don't know who he was, can you just share who he was, please?
Thank you so much. He was the organizer and architect of the 1963 Birmingham Children's Crusade, the open housing work in Chicago that ultimately led to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. He was the first to call for the march from Selma to Montgomery. And as you mentioned about the film, Common portrays my father in that film. So his work is significant. I recently just posted on LinkedIn some FBI files that I found after the FBI, of course, told me that they had destroyed all of his records, but this is America. And it's him calling out because of genocide, accusing our nation of genocide, and also the cover-up around Dr. King's assassination.
And I think it's so important because when we think about we have this, as Dr. Tama said earlier, many of us, this good, bad, we have these binaries, right? So I envision, what would it look like if we could show the complexities of everyone, right? And say, oh no, that's impossible. He didn't do that because he, helped us get the right to vote. All these things, that it's so important that we understand that our heroes are complex human beings.
Yeah. It's interesting. He said something earlier that really resonated with me when he was talking about how we can think about navigating the journey of childhood sexual abuse and violence without the carceral state. We didn't set out to begin having trial with our father. We actually approached him as a sibling group and said, you've led movements that change the world. We will stand with you as your children, your daughters and sons. What would it look like if you stood up and you said, I am a pedophile, and I am going to lead a new movement for those people that are interested, perhaps, in redemption. And at the time, when he said no, I thought he was unwilling. What I realized later is he was unable.
Thank you. That resonates. That unable. Wow. Well, thank you, Shabara. I'm gonna bring up Janice, and then we'll have everyone come up.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sister Janice, can you turn on your camera, please? And we're switching ASL interpreters. back to Nicole. I'm gonna pin the video. Thank you, Yolanta. So Janice is, we talked and she, we're gonna have a conversation. She's not gonna read from her chapter, but I'm just gonna give an overview. So first, let me say who Janice is. Janice Mizrahi Poindexter is a visionary Black trans woman survivor, award-winning advocate, and the mother of the legendary House of Mizrahi. She is also an advocate for Equality Michigan, correct? And so I met Janice at the same time that I met Nicole Denson here in DC, where I'm based, and at the Black Women's Blueprint held their March for Black Women, and heard these sisters speak and just said, hey, I'm doing this anthology. And I need to say that at that time it was September of 2018, and I had to submit the manuscript by like October. So Nicole, Janice, and Kalima Johnson, who you'll hear from tomorrow, they had to really turn it around really quickly. I felt just really called to include their stories. And Janice's story, there are not many in the anthology who actually use the criminal justice system, and Janice is one of them. And I think it's very important to share Janice's story as well, and the other contributors have talked about who use the criminal justice system. And I use justice in quotation because we know that it is complex in terms of putting people behind bars and cages. So I really want to be clear about that. And simultaneously, it's so unusual for trans women to get any form of justice in this racist, sexist, transphobic criminal justice system. She was assaulted by a police officer and pressed charges against that police officer, who was held accountable within the criminal justice system. And in her story, which she goes into detail, really talks about just the intersections. Everybody's talking about intersectionality, but really talking about the intersections of race and gender and gender identity. Janice was basically pulled off the streets, was accused of something that she had not done, and was put in jail. And so the assault happened while incarcerated for something that she was falsely accused of. So, and we hear these stories, we know it because of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many more. And so I just, when I heard Janice's story, I just was like, please, can we include your story in the anthology? So I just wanted to talk to you about that, Janice. And thank you for agreeing to contribute and for being on this conversation, and just ask you about your process and journey, sister.
Of course. Well, first of all,
can you speak up a little? Can't hear you.
Thank you all for sharing space with me. First of all, I have to give honor to God, who is the head of my life and who is the gift giver of life itself, that I appreciate so much. So I'll tell you, Aisha, I thank you so much for creating this space, especially for me. I have not talked about this very much. I just kind of choose not to, but it definitely impacts how I arrive to my work, and how the kind of passion that I put behind my advocacy. So I appreciate the platform and, of course, sharing space with all of the contributors.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I really am curious about the work and I just want to encourage people to get the book, Love with Accountability, from AK Press. It's available as an ebook. It's a special COVID sale for $1.99, so you could get it right now, and it can be on your e-reader. And then you can also buy it as a print copy from AK Press. But I really wanted to ask you, Janice, to talk about just the work that you do in trans communities. One of the points that you make in the book is the struggles. So you share your story, but then you talk about the struggles that you know, trans women of color, Black trans women struggle with in terms of when we're saying Black Lives Matter, do we really mean all Black Lives Mattering? And the violence that happens against trans women in communities. So I just would like for, you know, to talk about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's a conversation that can go on and on, but
Okay, Sheila.
It's really tricky because you look at the harm, and you look at violence, and you look at the news, and you know how it is kind of captured and then translated, and you hear the stories that really tug at your heart and that really just kind of make you cringe. And what I've noticed, and from my experience, my lived experience, is there's the same concern and built-in care that is extended to most people. It just is not extended to trans women of color, particularly Black trans women, because we are literally being killed and slaughtered in the streets. That kind of is up to a genocide level at this point. And there's no concern for what happens to women like me. I was talking to a woman that I respect and revere a lot. I really do. And I just, you know, I still do. But our interaction, I was talking to her about a trans woman that was killed here in Detroit by a Black pastor. And I was speaking to her just about the key points of the case, that the young woman, you know, was left in the middle of the street about 5 a.m. It was an hour before the pastor had to be to work. The young lady was killed, and then the pastor went to work, took a shower, changed his clothes, and then called the police. And so, you know, just kind of laying it out to her. And her response to me was, she didn't hear any of that. She made a point and a statement about speaking about the prosecutor that was assigned to the case. She was like, you know, that's the one who always does the hate crimes. She said, so he really doesn't stand a chance. And when she said it, I looked over, because I am not the person that, if I'm reacting, you know. And so I looked over at her, and I was literally stunned, and I was like, wow, like that is where your concern and your care went to, the fact that he's not going to stand a chance in the judicial system. But I just explained and eloquently laid it out to you about how this woman was murdered, you know, just murdered, shot and dead, cold blood. And there was no attachment to care for that. And that's usually the experience, sadly, that I, as a trans woman, a Black trans woman, experience. A lot of times, my first set of violence and discrimination and abuse and abusive language and ostracizing and, you know, forced disconnection from the household and the family, it comes from the family. It comes from the mom. It comes from the dad. It comes from the cousins. It comes from the uncles. And it's almost, if you look real deep into the culture, it's almost like a rite of passage. Oh, you know, you kicked that fag's ass, you know. Oh, I know, did you kick that he, she's, that, you know, just that type of hate and rhetoric that you experience. And you just like, it's like you are not hated for what you done or what you said or, you know, mistakes that you made. I'm just hated just for being. And that's heavy, and it's something that you have to kind of peel back the onions for every day if you're navigating this society. But just to realize the low level of value that my life has in my culture and to my own people, it is really, really sad. A couple weeks ago on social media, there was this young man, and he was doing a post and like a live video, and he was just explaining how he now feels that the BLM movement is being hijacked by the LGBTQ community, particularly the care and concern that is now being expressed for the Black trans woman. And he just went on and on and on. And as I watched him, and as I kind of took it all in and just dissected it and processed it a bit, I realized that he was a lot of our brothers, he was a lot of our dads, he was a lot of our sisters and our cousins and our uncles. Like, that was him. And so I realized that of course we're going to need legislative and policy change, but there has to also be a culture shift. There has to be a culture awakening that happens with all of these initiatives and these policies and these pushes, because my number one killer, your number one killer, Aisha, as a Black woman, is a Black man. And so, you talk about the BLM movement and you talk about the fight for equality. What I don't understand is how my people don't understand that those parallels in those fights. The same way you want to end discrimination against your Black skin, I want to end discrimination against my being. The same way you want people to just honor you and respect you as a human, and not commit a hate crime against you and lynch you and put you up in a tree. That's the same way that I don't want my head blown off, or I don't want my head dismembered, and put in the back of a car and you ride around with limbs at your house, like another case here in Detroit. So when I think about all of this stuff, I'm preparing for battle in so many fights that I get confused. And it's so toxic and so heavy at times that it's hard to navigate. And the only thing that's really kept me is my faith, my trust in God's word. And even there, I experienced, you experience such hate, because let's be very clear and honest. The church is not always the best people if you're looking for integrity or character, or real righteousness. The church has been very harmful. The church, it often spews a lot of hate. And so what I've mastered in deepening my walk and within my faith is I've mastered the beauty of relationship with Christ. Mm-hmm. So that I am not trying to meet this standard or that standard. As long as I trust and obey, as long as I keep my heart clean, and as long as I keep my spirit open to his voice. He said that his children will hear his voice. So that means not everyone. That means only the people who have taken that time to really cultivate that relationship and really go to those depths of spirituality that many express, but few really experience to the level that is transformative.
Thank you, Janice. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna invite everyone to turn on their cameras and so that we can just all be here. And so we can all see everyone. And all right. So, and just want to thank we're not ending, but I want to acknowledge Nicole Schamberger and Yolanta Galloway for, making this accessible in terms of language accessibility. And I just wanted to remember a line that you shared, Janice, at the end of, in one of your paragraphs, you shared you said, it is society's fault that our gender assignment at birth doesn't reflect who we truly are. And I think that we need to just remember that and not, you know, and also Etsy Betts, one of the contributors, also talks about that in terms of consent. Like, did people consent to the gender assignment at birth? So I really wanted to bring that. So we don't have a lot of time, but I really wanted all of us to engage their questions here. And also Sheila Alexander Reed has been holding it down behind the scenes. Grateful. And I guess maybe we could do Tangi Gilliam. Hello, Tangi. She has a question for you, Janice. She says, I get and see a lot of shit directed towards pretty well-educated Black women. Do you think that on a basic level, it's possible that Black trans women get so much directed to them because we want but can't match or fly? I just don't, I'm just repeating the question.
No. I'm reading it as well. That was funny. That's a hoot.
I was reading it in real time, so.
I mean, that's what she expressed in her question is something that is very real. Often I hear a lot of my sisters, you know, like, oh, you know, you want to be me. And, you know, that's that's the direction that the hate will come from. Oh, you just want to be me and you could never have children. And I'm very bold and blunt about it. If you talk to me, so I'm like, look, I know that I can't have children. I don't even go around, you know, screaming to the hilltops that I'm a woman. I don't do that. But I do tell you that I'm a lady and everything about me is a lady. And if you can connect there, I mean, you have to just deal with it, because there's women who go to charm school and who go to etiquette school and all. I mean, they literally have to learn how to be. And I was a child. I didn't kind of choose and say, okay, well, I'll pick the cupcakes over the basketball. It's very natural for me. You know what I'm saying? So I didn't have a point where it was a choice. And people need to accept that it's a biological thing. That's the way my doctor broke it down to my mom. He said, you know, the truth is that this person has more female hormones than male. That's just the truth. Like, nobody can go in and redo that. That's just what it is. And when my mother began to just accept that and just deal in the reality of things, our relationship got a lot better. And it also helped me realize and take away some confusion, because I also struggled, like, well, you know, what do I do? And will God still love me? Will he still hear my prayers? And am I able to live a good life? And what is a good life and a normal life to me? You know, so all of these things kind of ran through my head and ran through my spirit. But like I said, my solid rock has been God.
Thank you. I wanted to, there was a question that was emailed. There was a question that was emailed before we gathered, and she asked, she said, my question is, as a teacher, I wonder about ways you would have liked to hear secondary and elementary school teachers speaking about child abuse or about grooming or discussing how to get help from a trusted adult. In what ways can teachers show up for Black students related to this topic when they teach help? Sir Key, did you want to? Oh wait, we need to do a interpreter switch. Is that my understanding? And then Key. So let's put Yolanta on just a moment. All right.
Yeah, I think one is a big thing about like consent practices, right? And so like, how are we teaching young people about consent when they're little, right? Like, do you make a child hug all their family members before they leave? Do they get to have a choice around that? Do they get to choose, you know, just like, not necessarily like, you know, sometimes children don't get to make choices about their life, but do they get to express their feelings and opinions, right? Without it being immediately shot down, right? So I think trusting feelings, and I really appreciated what Dr. Moss said earlier about, you know, you can say that you're a trustworthy adult, but you also have to show that you're a trustworthy adult. And I think part of that is about, you know, listening to children and accepting their feelings, right? And saying like, oh, there's no reason to have feelings about that. I was a young person who was constantly told I was too sensitive, I had too many feelings, that I needed thicker skin, and really made it easy for me not to trust adults in my life when I had feelings around things that were hard. And so like those are things that contribute to young people feeling like they can't speak their truth. So I think part of that is I really, really like the way that Dr. Moss talked about like the social contract about adults and children, because I think that's absolutely true. And I think we end up doing more harmful things under the guise of trying to protect children.
Did anyone else want to respond to that question? Okay.
I also think that, oh, sorry.
So, okay, we'll go you, Danielle, and then Tima. Go ahead.
I think training and preparation are a really important aspect of like who in a school building, who in a youth organization is equipped to have these conversations. You know, I don't want to see Black and brown families further pathologized by people who mean well and want to open up space to have conversation. So I think that there's an education opportunity that we have to be sure about. You know, in 2010, 70% of all new teachers in the New York City public school system were actually white. So there's like the disappearance and erasure of Black educators and youth workers from the building. So I just also kind of like want to name that. You know, I think the relationship doesn't start at the point of trauma. Again, I just would reiterate that you have to be laying the foundation. And young people have to see you make different decisions based on their feedback. So a lot of times we invite young people to the table in a very kind of like condescending, gratuitous way. But we don't make structural or organizational changes based on what they have to say. We don't make budget decisions based on what young people have to say a lot of times. So it's really about upending this whole foundation. And, you know, as a mom, my daughter's now 24, I got a lot of criticism because of my willingness to kind of hear what she had to say on a lot of issues, because that was so far removed from my family tradition in terms of like, you know, my mother was a big believer in children should be seen and not heard. I don't think she understood that, you know, kids take that literally. And so I was seen and I made sure nobody heard my voice. So it's really about reimagining, rethinking, reinventing what it means to be in relationship with children and to listen to their voices.
Thank you so much. I would agree that we want to be tuned into training. And one of the things that's a benefit of rape crisis centers is that they will send educators out to schools for free and provide workshops for children. For the very young ones, they often frame it as good and bad touch. But then as the kids are older, giving them the explicit language and definitions of what these constructs are. And as I was listening, I was reminded of a client I had who described not knowing what was happening to her in terms of her father molesting her until one day at her church, the only time in the year for Women's Day, they had a guest speaker who was a woman, and the woman in her sermon talked about sexual violence and molestation. And she said they never brought that woman preacher back again, but when she said it, she held on to it and had an understanding of what was happening to her. So it is powerful, the ways that we can equip children to make meaning and understanding to what is happening that has not been named.
Shabara?
Yes, what I wanted to add as a mother too, and as a practitioner in the DEI space, I know that one of the things that I did very early, my sons are now 31 and 27, but they've long known about my survivorship. And so how I raised them was certainly informed by that journey. And then as a practitioner in the DEI space, one of the things I just wanted to bring up is that just a couple of years ago, Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequality released a study, Girlhood Interrupted. We were just hearing about the erasure of teachers in schools. And so this is about the erasure of Black girls' childhood. And what the research showed is that as young as 5, little Black girls are seen as needing less nurturing and less care and more informed about sex. And so I think in the context of what educators and whether you're in a faith-based space or educational institution should be doing, this awareness that for little Black girls, it's 5 to 14. For Black boys, it's starting at 10. But that's really significant because of the particular findings around believing that we as little Black girls know more about sex, need less protection, need less nurturing and less care. And so that culminates into this high rate of abuse that we see in our community.
I'm going to read two questions, and then I will let you all. We have like 10 minutes left. So, one is, thank you for your love and care. I'm a therapist and also survivor. My harm doer is my brother and my mother, as she protected him, and I have confronted them both and have established boundaries. However, grief steeps in some days. Can the panelists speak to the feelings of loss and grief? So that's one question. And then the next, and this will be the last question, is Express Arte, the organization I started, is facilitating an abolition. Oh, wait, let me not. That's okay. I'll deal with that. That's a personal question. Or no, actually, they're doing a panel on an abolition series, and one of the topics is centered on abolition in survivorhood, and what Aisha and any other collaborator would like to participate on the panel. So we'll put an email out, and then I can connect you with all of the contributors. So we don't need to figure that out right now. But I would like for panelists to please, who are moved, to speak to the questions around dealing with grief after confronting, your mother and your brother in response to the violence experience.
I really appreciate you sharing, and an important part of the healing work is the mourning of the losses and what was taken, what we had and was removed, and what we never had. And even though there can be some liberation that takes place in the confrontation, even as you name, it does not erase the loss, right, and the grief. So I am appreciative that you were able to speak truth. And at the same time, there is then the internal work, right? There's the external piece of how do I navigate these relationships, but there is also what I am left with, what I am sitting with. And I would say particularly for Black survivors, we often are not afforded the space for our grief, for despair, for depression. And many times the language we heard growing up was fix your face, right? And so we have learned to fix our face. And as the poem says, we wear the mask. And people say, how are you? And we say blessed and highly favored. And there has to be some space for transparency where we don't have to, especially you mentioned being a therapist, often we are the giver to other people or caretakers or the strong one among your friends. But the need for mutuality, for reciprocity, for safe spaces for our tears, and for us to be able to speak the truth of our pain.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kama. I don't know, Shavar, if you saw in the chat from Michelle Parkerson, where she shared that I followed your story and the sexual molestation case involving you, your sisters, and late father for many years via the Washington Post and other media outlets. Your incredible survival and the pathology you broke deserve a larger telling. And Michelle also said, I think she wrote something in response to Danielle's comments, but there's too many comments to scroll through, but I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It's like behind the scenes in front of the scenes. So just wanted to bring that to your attention. And also Danielle Cole said that to Danielle Moss, that your discussion and comments were incredible. As a former youth worker, now reconnecting with my own inner child, it's incredible and important to hear. So I didn't know if you all wanted to say, in fact, I'll let everyone just, with 5 minutes left, have everyone just to please say comments either in response or just final comments for like a minute, please. Whoever would like to start, I don't know.
I'll say, oh, Key, do you want to go first?
Oh, no, please.
You know, I think that there is not a beginning, middle, and end in terms of healing. And so I just want to name that, you know, some of the sexual violence I experienced was not at the hand of anyone that I knew. It was just a stranger pulling a knife on me on my way home from the store. And so I feel like in that moment, as a result of that experience when I was 12, I knew what the fear of death was. I mean, I felt it in my body. And the only thing that saved me was my fear, because I started to physically convulse. My attacker ran, actually, was just like, didn't know what was happening with me. And so I share that to say that, you know, you never kind of get completely on the other side of that. But what I have done since I started to kind of explore and discuss this trauma in therapy is to really make a decision within myself that I was worth something more and that something more was possible. And just to kind of like focus in my mind's eye on the possibility of my life, and not to, I'm very competitive. And so the idea that someone else would dictate the story of my life and that I would not be able to overcome or win because of someone else's choices was just something that I couldn't reconcile. But it shapes everything about how you see yourself, how you see your body, how you see your attractiveness. I can remember getting a sick feeling if somebody liked what I had on or paid me a compliment, because I felt like, oh, this, you know, this is where this leads to. And, you know, just battling with my weight and battling with how I feel about myself, my physical self. So there's not like a, you know, it's a trauma that lives with you, but there is something more possible on the other side. But you have to, you have to want it. You have to stay focused. You have to get therapy. You have to be in community like this, because you feel more visible when you're in community with other people who understand the depth of that pain. But it is possible to live a life. And I just want to make sure that people hold on to that.
Thank you. I got to ask everybody to please be brief. We don't have a lot of time.
Sorry.
I want to give everyone just a chance
Sorry
to
about
say
that.
closing. Shavara, you want to go?
Sure. Thank you for that. I just want to say I have much gratitude for everyone holding space for me, holding space for our stories. And I do want to say to the people that are listening, I know my mom is in the audience listening and watching us, and I want to say thank you so very much for being strength for me, for believing me, and for holding space for my truth. Thank you.
I too want to say the same thing. I feel very, very blessed to be able to share space with you all in this way, in such a raw, authentic way. I thank you, I appreciate you, and God's blessings and loves to you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Janice. Dr. Tama?
I thank you all, and thank you, Aisha, for the vision and leadership. And I would just offer for us to remember, as we seek to be a voice in the movement against sexual violence, to also remember that our rest is resistance, our joy is resistance, our love is resistance.
Nicole?
Hey, what is left to be said, you all? Like, what could I say that could be any different or any more magnificent than this whole entire night? I am humble. I have so much gratitude, and I'm so thankful for you all. And I'm excited for us loving on our next generation and keeping these conversations. And to be honest, we're forever entrenched with each other in this beautiful book. We can share each other's stories. I love you all.
Thank you. Key, you get the next to last word.
I just wanted to give a deep, deep gratitude to everyone, and just was reflecting on how much I've learned, and I'm humbled by the stories of Black women sharing their truths. And as somebody who had a Black girlhood, but not necessarily a Black womanhood, it's been also incredibly healing for me to be in space with such amazing folks who, are just sharing truths in ways that we're often just told that we shouldn't. So I'm just deeply, deeply grateful to everyone and to everybody who came to participate, and always deeply grateful to you, Aisha. I love you very much.
I love you, Key. I love you all. Thank you. And so I want to just share that this recording will be made available. Everybody who's on this webinar is registered, so you'll get an email with the recording. All of the contributors, I create a resource list with their contact information, as well as other resources. So that will be available. I will send that out in the email. Either myself or someone will send that out. And tomorrow we will be here again for the Book Talk 4. And I will also include that in the email, but it's tomorrow, same time, same place, Zoom, 6 p.m. with another group of 6 contributors. There are 44 contributors in this anthology. So 44 diasporic Black people are talking about sexual violence and healing in ways that don't replicate what has been committed against us and our loved ones. So thank you all, and thank you to the contributors, to the ASL interpreters, Yolanta Galloway and Nicole Schemberger. Thank you to my partner, Sheila Reed, who's been holding it down. And thank you all for your presence. And have a good night and take care. Peace.